Welcome to the third talk in a series about reciprocity. Last week's talk was about self, the awareness of the self, the sort of small self. If you drop into your inner world right now and you experience what you can experience here, and then notice sort of the edges of that, that's the small self, your inner world, your experience of this embodied person with a personality and a name, a birthday, and eventually a day of passing that is to come. And I talked a lot about the big self, the self with a capital S, the experience of the aspect of the self that always has been and always will be, the experience that, as we talked about last week, our meditation teachers tell us we access by allowing ourselves to be awareness. Your awareness right now is not actually bound by time and space. And when you're in the awareness of the moment, there is no past, there is no future. Awareness doesn't need a body to be aware of, or a personality. And I shared some quotes and I shared some techniques for experiencing the aspect of the self that is not limited. The rest of these talks are really about how to accept our limitations. That the acceptance is a huge part of today's theme. How to accept our limitedness. And how to experience our relationships in such a way that both removes, if we have healthy, right relationships, that helps remove a lot of the obstacles to us experiencing that deeper meditative state, that to experience ourself with a capital S. And also in my experience, we can actually begin to taste the infinite when we start to realize that the limited self is always necessarily in relationship, and that the relationships take us beyond the small self boundaries. Most of what I want to share today, in many ways, we just experienced in that guided meditation. What I shared right at the beginning of that is, and we can all do it again and right now, notice right now that this experience that you're having of a small self, the experience that you're having of a self has kind of edges, it has boundaries. You can just kind of feel your body, and okay, these are the edges, and inside of that space is my inner world. The inner world is the space that's your autonomous zone, right? Or that's your space of autonomy. This is the space that no other being has access to. This is the space that when we sit down to meditation, we drop into and care for. But you'll also notice that the space that this body relies a bigger space to be inside of, what in the meditation I was calling a world. And every limited being in my experience of this universe, um, maybe it's different elsewhere, I don't know, but in this universe, a being who is embodied is going to belong to a world. And you can think of the world as it's almost this container that is made up of beings and entities and elements, and all of the beings and the entities and elements that are in that container take care of each other, interact with each other. Each one, presumably like you, has an autonomous zone, has its area that its awareness is directly in charge of. And then agency out in this world and belonging to this world. Being in moments of where you have access to the big self. There are countless descriptions throughout the ages um, of what that feels like, and I shared a couple of those last week too. That experience of bliss, really, where we are no longer bound by bodies, right? Or at least we don't feel stuck in them. Where we really have work to do is when we can't, it seems to me, is when we cannot accept our limitedness. When we have it, when we struggle with that. And so, what I would love for you to experiment with in this next week or two until the next talk is in the moments where things are challenging, what about your limitations and your belonging to the world are causing suffering? See if you can bring your awareness back to your inner experience, to your autonomous zone, take a few breaths and inquire a little bit. And you will probably land on one frustration or lack of acceptance, resistance, to either the fact that this limited thing that you are needs to receive. We could kind of put in these categories, right? My needs. I mean, it's really what a name for that category is, just needs. Probably get frustrated sometimes that you need, and perhaps whatever it is that you're receiving doesn't feel like what you wanted or whatever. But if you really follow all the way back, there's probably some little part of you that goes, I just wish I didn't need. And then the other side of that is the world needs you. That's part of the deal and the participation in the container. You were given the container when you were given the body. They come together. You couldn't have just showed up on Mars. It doesn't work that way, right? Or maybe you could have, but not in this body, right? Not with your name, not the small self. And part of that deal of being given a body and a world is that world requires your participation. And you don't even have to be conscious of it necessarily for that participation to happen, but the world is receiving from you. And this is true on a biological level, though it gets tricky. Humans have made it a little tricky, right? But you know, a mammal out in nature has its ways that it is giving and that it's receiving. And in our passing, we are compost for the earth and feed lots of buggies and, the soil and different, this beautiful, beautiful cycle. The air, atmosphere, as we've talked about many times, because I think it's so amazing to remember, but the atmosphere is being co-created by every creature here right now, including you. Your exhales are part of the co-creation of an atmosphere. And today I'm not going to get into, what it means that the human participation currently is taking a lot more than it's giving, is damaging the container that we were given along with this embodiment. That's a problem, obviously. Instead, we're going to focus on looking at and how we can investigate for ourselves these kind of two sides of belonging to the world, receiving and giving, having needs, needing a world, and the world needing us. So as we talked about in the meditation, there are biological needs, physical needs that you have. Your body cannot go on without air, water, food. It would have a pretty hard time without some amount of shelter or protection or clothing, right? Sunshine, of course, is necessary for all of this equation. And in previous explorations that we've done here in Nowhere Village, and even before I started Nowhere Village, when we work on the coordinates, if you remember that, if you don't worry. What I'm really talking about is, what are your sources? What are the things that are taking care of you right now? And for me, at least, doing a little reflection on those natural sources, on those biological sources, the sources that take care of our bodies. For me, that's something that I do with every meditation. For me, it's right there at the beginning, basically, as I connect to the breath. But also when I connect to care, thinking about Mother Nature herself and just this whole world that I get to belong to physically. And so one inquiry, one little exercise that I think is just really beautiful is to write down, to make a list of all the beings that you can think of, or entities or elements that you rely on, and to find a way to kind of build into your practice, to build into your day, an honoring of that. And that's really at the heart of, most religions and spiritual traditions, is some way of acknowledging that and honoring it. But of course, we're biologically designed to also be social, to belong to a world that is not just a world of nature, but to belong to a family and a society, and all these kinds of little containers inside of that. And I invite you to start to explore. I mean, for me, this idea of container / world is really helpful, and it's something that will come up again in the next talk for sure. But we are designed to, just like my dog is, dogs and wolves or canines are social. they are designed to live in a pack. It doesn't feel right to not live in a pack. There's a lot of creatures like this. When I first started raising chickens, I was kind of surprised by it at first, and then it began to make a lot of sense once I watched how the chickens were together. It's not, at least in New York State, it wasn't legal to buy, or it wasn't possible. They wouldn't allow you to buy less than 3 chickens, because the chicken's sense of safety and belonging, they can't kind of do their chicken thing without that sense of the other chickens around. The ducks were really extreme with it. The ducks, if you ever watch, like, they would like move. I had like 20 of them or something, but you'd watch them moving around the farm, just like one being, and they're all following each other. And birds in the sky, you've probably seen like that too. I think they call that a murmur. But anyway, some creatures are absolutely designed to work in a team, and to belong to not just sky and earth and sun and water, but also to belong to each other, to belong to other beings. And we are designed like this. And so the inquiry, here's, the next kind of step of this kind of inquiry on what are my needs that are being fulfilled, um, looking at the social relationships that you have, the other people in your life, and I would love for you to explore, and I'll just share these as like a list along with this talk, these inquiry questions. But as you investigate, you could kind of look at it like this. If you're having physical issues, what are the physical needs that are not being met, or the way that they're being met is causing some other issue, right? I might be not starving, I've got food coming in, but maybe the type of food that I'm eating isn't really working for my body right now, and it's creating these other issues. It's solving one problem, but creating sort of another problem, right? It's solving the problem of starvation, but it's creating this other problem. Of course, air quality, these things that we think about, the quality of what we receive physically affects our physical health. And if we're having emotional issues, which of course all of these are interrelated, it's not as clear as maybe we would like it to be sometimes, but if we're having emotional issues, what are the emotional needs that you usually need other beings to some extent to help us with? What are those emotional needs? Who are our sources for meeting our emotional needs? What is the health of those relationships? Exploring for yourself, how does it feel when your needs are met? It may just be rare moments, but in the moments where your needs have been met, you feel safe, you feel connected, all the levels are kind of just doing okay. It's a lot easier to accept whatever's going on, all the limitations and all of the challenges and the temporariness, the losses and the gains that we didn't necessarily ask for or aren't necessarily in total control of. All of this becomes so much easier to accept when our needs are getting met. In other words, when we're in right relationship with our sources. And I'll say that for whatever reason, for me, writing down my needs and really observing for myself who's meeting them or what, observing for myself when something is off, what might be off about that relationship, or perhaps the place where I've gone to get my needs met, that source actually doesn't serve up what I need. Or maybe it can serve up about half of what I need, and I'm going to need to find another well that can serve up the other half of that. So all of that investigation of our needs, how they're being met, and the adequacy of that, getting really honest about that is very challenging for me. It feels scary somehow. It feels somehow sometimes for me like, oh gosh, I'm almost like I'm inventorying. It almost feels hard, unkind to my sources, if that makes any sense. Experiment with it for yourself. You might come up with your own struggles that you have with it, but I find this is challenging and also really helpful and illuminating, and ultimately makes me appreciate my sources more. What we're really talking about is awareness. Use this inquiry process to become more aware. And what I find is ultimately as I become more aware, I also become much more grateful for what I am receiving. And meanwhile, I become much more honest about what I'm not receiving and empowered. Then I get to have agency and go and resource for myself, whether that's by going to a source and saying, I actually need a little bit more of this from you, or realizing that, again, like I said, I need maybe a team that helps me with this, not just one person. So that investigation is something that I really encourage you to take up in some capacity in these next couple of weeks, and let me know, what obstacles you come across and challenges, and we can talk further about that, if that's something that people are working on and interested in. And then, of course, the other half of this inquiry is, what are my gifts? How is my relationship with my scions? And this used to be really hard for me, and over time has become easier for me. But acknowledging what it is that the world is receiving from you. And again, it can be really helpful, just like we did, oh wow, I need the air and the earth and the sky, and I need a friend to give me a hug when I feel sad, and I need a friend to jump up and down with me when I have a victory. Those are all legitimate needs, and recognizing who it is in my world that does those things for me, with me. In the same way, it can be really helpful to look around and say, who are my scions? Who is it that's receiving from me? And what do they get from me? And at this juncture, in this half of the exploration, I find that it can be really, really helpful to ask some of those sources, especially if you struggle with figuring out what your gifts are. Ask them what they get from you, and then really listen and try to receive the truth of that. And the inquiry process can kind of go along the same lines. Like I said, I'll share some with you after this, but what does it feel like to give and to have the world, or your scions, or what does it feel like to be received? What does it feel like when you have gifts to give, but you can't quite find a place to give them? You can't find quite a place that really appreciates your unique gifts. Or perhaps the scions that are in your life, they can't receive kind of all of you. Maybe there's another audience or another little receptacle for that, another little container that you can plug into. Also in this half of the inquiry, I am very interested in which gifts are really natural and feel like they're really flowing from you, and which ones does it feel like it's a lot of work to kind of manufacture and then push out into the world. That's another really interesting place of inquiry for me. The goal for the yogi, meditator, person on the path of enlightenment is to come to a place of where the giving and the receiving feels natural and organic and not very forced, where our awareness and acceptance of our needs and our gifts, of our limited self and the bigger container that it happens to be born into, that our awareness and acceptance of these things results in, takes us into a place of such deep trust. Trust, when I trust my needs are going to be met, I'm free of fear. Some of the quotes from our last talk a couple weeks ago were about this theme of the one who sees the mutual belonging of the container, that of all of us in the container, feels no fear, and therefore becomes enlightened. So when my needs are getting met and I'm not worried about that, that is that deep, deep sense of trust that eventually leads us through the doorway into that experience of the big self of it is an effortlessness that we experience. And then same with if I trust that who I am and what I naturally have to give without a bunch of manufacturing or dressing it up or, efforting beforehand or whatever, if I realize that the world is yeah, it's like soaking it in and being nourished by me, then I get this deep, deep sense of belonging and purpose and care. It makes me generous and stable. And again, without fear. And I said this at the top of the talk, I'm just saying it in a slightly different way now, but when we are suffering, when we are struggling, when the kleshas are present, one of those 5 is fear, right? Follow the trail back through inquiry and see where you land, but you're probably going to land on some version of, I am afraid my needs are not going to be met, or I'm afraid that if I keep getting my needs not met, I will perish in some way, whether that's physically or emotionally or somehow on our soul level. Something about me that feels important is going to not survive because my needs aren't getting met. And or getting to this place realizing that my gifts are either, sometimes I feel like this, I felt like this before in a relationship, that I'm pouring out my gifts, but because that person doesn't want them or need them, or that version of them, they're kind of just getting poured into a black hole. Then I feel like I'm wasting my life force and my opportunity to be here. And for me, that leads to this deep fear of, like, I'm going to get kicked out of the container. Like I'm not going to deserve my place in the world. And deeming me not useful enough, the world is going to go, whether that's the mini world of a relationship, right? A one-on-one relationship creates a kind of container. Or it's the world of my job, or it's the world of the play, right? If I get cast in a play, if I don't do a good enough job, I'll have a lot of anxiety as I learn my lines, and if I don't do a good enough job, they'll recast. So for me, my fears kind of ultimately come down to some version of those. And of course, like any, the our gifts and our needs are kind of, if you imagine the yin yang symbol, you see that, and there's the side that's black, but in the middle of the black side, there's a white circle. And in the middle of the white side of the yin yang, there's a black circle. I can only, one of these. Anyway, I can only wink with one eye. I'm not gonna figure that out right now. Anyway, inside of the black side, there's right at the center, there's this white circle, and on the white side, there's a black circle. Our gifts and our needs are like that. In that, right at the center of our needs is the need to give, is the need to be a giving being. And right at the center of our needs is our gift that we are needing beings. What I mean is that we have the gift of being limited, which means that we need to be in relationship, which means that we seek out these beautiful relationships that we get to participate in. So what I'm trying to say is, at the center of your needs are your gifts, and at the center of your gifts are your needs. And ultimately, what I would love for us to be working on these next couple weeks is deep acceptance of all of that. Noticing when we get out of balance and we're trying to give too much, deny that we have needs. And when do we do the other? When do we feel so needy and so afraid and desperate on this end that we forget all the gifts that we're giving all the time? Getting stuck in either becomes really problematic, right? Getting stuck in I'm just a gift and I need to give all the time. I'm sure you could see the different ways that can become very problematic, kind of narcissistic too. And I'm sure you can also see how in our society, I actually find that that's the bigger issue, is people building their identity upon being a giver, and then we're not just giving our natural gifts, we're also giving all this kind of manufactured stuff that really isn't our natural gift or organic gift, and it's maybe too much to give. In our society, I think it's a little harder in a way to build our identity upon that, neediness or codependency. But of course, in my life, I've gotten stuck in both spaces. But it is interesting when you back up and start to see the kind of bigger narratives. American culture in particular is so this idea of individualism is so predominant that it does very much affect how we experience all of this, and therefore affect our spiritual practices and our relationships. And all of that is up for you to explore. Follow whatever from this talk has felt most interesting, or kind of rattled something in you, or curiosity, and like I said, I'll share some inquiry questions along with this talk. And all of this exploration will lead us up to what I'm going to talk about next time, the actual exchanges. How do we now start to navigate those exchanges? How do we bring the right kind of attitude of care for the little part that we play and the little self that we're in charge of, and for this bigger container and all the other little beings that we interact with inside of it. So I will I will open this up for questions for those who are live, but ultimately I'm really kind of sending us off into the next couple of weeks to explore some of this for ourselves, to follow whatever single thread or maybe a couple threads from all the things I brought up that resonate with you, so that hopefully you can have some of your own discoveries.
I have a question that I have a question that I just want to consider and say out loud. People that are non-relational with other people. You think about people who live by themselves and are quite content with that. And it seems our culture in general is very anti that in general. And I'd love you to talk to that a little bit in terms of acceptance.
Yeah, thank you, Pam. Um, yes, absolutely. There are people who and some people who I deeply admire, who I consider my gurus or teachers, who have chosen a life of solitary living. And a couple of things about that, because I know I do talk a lot about the importance of connection and community. I mean, and I created something called Nowhere Village because I wanted a sort of a space that felt like a community space online for us to share our practices. I so deeply value what I get out of community. It's a really big theme for me. Um, there have been a lot of studies recently about the effects of isolation for at least the average human being, right? Um, One famous thing that's quoted a lot is loneliness is as bad for you as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And they have all these studies coming out now about adolescents, the mental health crisis among adolescents and teenagers has just gotten really, really bad. And a lot of what they're finding is that for various reasons, but it seems like largely social media, the actual interactions, the actual social interactions are not happening as much as they used to. And this is causing a lot of issues for our youth. So there's a lot, there's a lot that's being said right now about the importance of healthy social connection. Now, that being said, the beings in our world, and my main example, of course, is sort of the monk who goes and lives in the cave, or right the retreat, the person who's on retreat, doing their spiritual practice. But of course, I think that Pam, you're also speaking of other people who've perhaps because of neurodivergence or just different ways that they're hooked up, just choose to not be as social, and but in both cases, I guess what I would like to propose is that these people are not experiencing loneliness. And something that maybe I should have said, I always love the questions. They always remind me of something that is actually really important on the theme. Something that I probably should have said right at the beginning is, FYI, you have to do your own inquiry about your needs and your gifts because every one of us is unique. We may all share the need for the biological basics of food, water, shelter, sun, breath, right? We might share those things, but I'm going to have really different needs than you, Pam, when it comes to all sorts of things. And that every single individual is autonomous and gets to explore for themselves and then gets to build a life for themselves, hopefully, ideally, if they live in a society that respects their autonomy and agency, that we each get to build that for ourselves and create that. That's part of the deal. And I know for myself, I mean, I've actually been really craving retreat recently and wanting to step away. I'm someone who is very social when I'm in the world. Connecting with other people is I'm all about that. But I actually benefit immensely from big old breaks from that. And that's when I get to really go into my inner world and take responsibility for it in a deeper way, that when I do reconnect out in the world, my relationships all feel smoother, healthier. The giving and receiving just happens a lot more naturally after I get back from my solitary time. But again, when I'm on retreat, I don't feel lonely. And I still have, and every being has still sources. Every being still has needs. Every being is still getting something from the world, right? I know that when I'm on retreat, I tend to make friends with the animals that are around. I'll tend to have a bird that starts to come by a lot when I'm meditating, or and my appreciation for my relationships with beings that aren't of my species grows incredibly. Partly because, I mean, at first I usually am lonely at the very beginning of retreat, right? I miss the world. I just plucked myself out of my container and put myself outside of it. And usually I go through some emotional stuff as I make that transition. And then what I start to realize is, oh, wait, all around me, there are friends. And I start to find new ways of connecting. And that's a lot of where that kind of rewiring and resetting happens. Okay, that's my response to that. Good. Thanks, Pam. All right, my friends. Well, we kind of bumped up right against the edge of our time. And so I'm gonna leave it there. But of course, we've got lots of time to keep exploring all of this. And I look forward to, yeah, any of your comments or responses or questions along the way. Those of us that are subscribers will have a sharing circle next Wednesday, where we can go deeper into any of this and just share about whatever's coming up for us.